It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. David Kessler to Google this afternoon. A graduate of Amherst College, the University of Chicago Law School, and Harvard Medical School, he served as Commissioner of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration under Presidents George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton. He is a pediatrician and has served as the Dean of Medical Schools at Yale and UCSF. The author of 2 books, Dr. Kessler's first book details his time at the FDA and discusses his work on tobacco regulations in the 1990s. Today, he is here to discuss his new book, The End of Overeating, Taking Control of the Insatiable American Appetite. As a former FDA commissioner and as both a doctor and a lawyer, Dr. Kessler has a unique perspective on human health, the role of government regulation, and the responsibilities of the food industry. I look forward to your talk, and welcome to Google.
Thank you for having me here today. If you look at the cover of the book, if you understand the cover, you understand the neuroscience of overeating. What grabs your attention?
The cake.
The cake? So we'll get back to it. That was done by the great graphic designer Chip Kidd, probably one of the most famous book jacket designers, and that signifies where your attention goes, the concept of salience, and we'll come back. But let me start from the beginning, tell you a little about the journey the last 7 years that led up to the book. I'm sitting in my office at Yale Medical School with a group of residents and fellows and medical students, and we were asking a very simple question. The question, if you want to stay alive, what can you do? I know what you're going to die of. 3/4 of us die from cardiovascular disease, stroke, and cancer. And we started looking at what's the evidence, what was the scientific evidence of things that we know work if you want to prevent those diseases. And as we were doing it, we were pulling a lot of articles from the library, and one of the librarians at Yale, I noticed she lost 30 pounds. Because if you know, at the core of many of those diseases, certainly cardiovascular disease, stroke, many forms of cancer, weight is a very, very significant risk factor. We're talking about healthcare reform. Everyone's in favor of greater universal access to healthcare. But if you realize that just diabetes, type 2 diabetes, I mean, I could on the medical record write the term obesity. The current thinking is what causes type 2 diabetes? It's really the accumulation of fat in muscle. And that leads in susceptible individuals to insulin resistance, which can go on to be diabetes because that fat in muscle alters the glucose metabolism. Just the number of cases of type 2 diabetes, if you go back a decade, it was 4.8 cases per 1,000 in the United States. In the last 10 years, that number alone has doubled. What do we spend on type 2 diabetes? Back in 2001, we spent $7 billion on drugs for type 2 diabetes. Today, we spend $13 billion on drugs for type 2 diabetes. Again, weight, obesity being the key determinant in susceptible individuals to the onset and etiology of type 2 diabetes. So I started thinking about, okay, trying to get a handle on weight and what was going on, because over my lifetime, I have suits in every size. And I asked my colleague, Catherine Flagel, who's one of the great epidemiologists at CDC, just tell me over a lifetime, over our adult years, how did our weight change? When I was growing up in the 60s and 70s, what was weight over a lifetime, and what is it today, and does it change? So Dr. Flagel has access to the NHANES data, the National Health Survey data, and you could see, right, that's the curve. You enter your 20s, right? So, I mean, on one of the axes, it's kilograms. So just double that amount. And then you have age from 20s to 74, right? So you see over a lifetime, and you have to be careful, because this really is cross-sectional data. But you see in general that weight increased a few pounds from 20 to 40, but really leveled off, and then you lost a few pounds, but was relatively stable over a lifetime. That's the 1960s. Here's the 1970 data. Here's the 1990 data. And here's the data in 2000. Okay? So what do you notice? What's the difference in that data, right? So the slope, right? I mean, you don't plateau as quickly. In your adult years, you keep on gaining weight. But what's the other thing you notice about those graphs? There's something else that is very different between the 1960s and 2000 that's dramatic. We're all a lot heavier, but it starts a lot. So you enter your adult years, you enter your 20s, significantly bigger on average in this country. So again, weight gain, very much both the onset in childhood and adolescence. But so what's going on over the last several decades that drove those changes in those curves? Because it's still, if you look at 2000, adults keep on gaining weight through their lifetime, and we don't know where that's going to end. We don't know whether we've plateaued or not. So I was watching Oprah one night, and I was sitting there listening to a woman, very well dressed, very well educated, very successful, and I was struck. She was there with Dr. Phil. Don't get me started on Dr. Phil. But I was listening to her, and she said, I eat when my husband leaves for work in the morning. I eat before he comes home at night. I eat when I'm happy. I eat when I'm sad. I eat when I'm hungry. I eat when I'm not hungry. And then, that moment where she says, and I don't like myself. And I was sitting there trying to listen as a physician and say, what's going on? What's driving that individual, successful in all aspects of her life, to do things that she doesn't want to be doing, that she knows she doesn't want to do, but she does it anyway. And she doesn't understand why she does it and doesn't like herself. And that was the question that we set out to try to understand over the last 7 years, to be able to explain to that individual, hopefully, that journey of what was going on. Because again, I could relate personally, having gained and lost weight, several times my entire body weight over my lifetime. Let me just start with some basic, assumptions, myths, if you were, and then take you into some of the science that we have done. In general, it was thought that people have a weight set point. The basic homeostatic mechanisms, that there is a set point, and that's why we have such a hard time losing weight, right? Because it's a genetically predetermined set point, and if we lose weight, we'll go back to that set point. And people said, well, there's not a lot I could do about it. But when you think about whether there's a set point, a genetic set point, in fact, if that were true, we wouldn't all be getting bigger and bigger, certainly over the last several decades. Now, there certainly is a settling point, but a lot of forces go into determining what that settling point is, and that's what we wanted to understand. Let me give you some pieces of the science and pieces of the puzzle, because this really is a mystery of why are we getting bigger, what's going on, and why can't that woman control what she wants to control. So let me give you the pieces of the puzzle and give you a number of pieces of scientific evidence, and we can put it together. We can all put it together. First point: in the presence of a varied and limitless diet, people tend to eat excessively. Now, I won't make any that's not meant to be an editorial on the Google cafeteria. I've been there, I've served on your health advisory board, but the fact is, if you look at animal data, and if you look at this, this graph, this is a graph from Peter Rogers in England, and you see this is animals over their lifetime. And that red line is from birth to adulthood, the gain in weight of an animal that's fed standard laboratory chow. But add to that diet what's known as the supermarket diet. Tony Sclafani at Brooklyn College, Peter Rogers have done that. And what you see is if you add peanut butter and crackers and cookies, you see the gain in weight of those animals in the blue and green lines. And if you take it away, right, the weight comes down. If you revert them to standard chow, the weight will come down, but will never come back down to where it was had you not fed those animals those foods. We published a paper, not the typical scientific title of in a journal, Deconstructing the Vanilla Milkshake. So we wanted to understand, is it the sugar, is it the fat, is it the flavor in a vanilla milkshake that drives intake? What do you think? How many think it's the sugar? Raise your hands. How many think it's the fat? How many think it's the flavor? Well, so what we did was we did tests where animals had to work for various combinations. They had to press a lever, right? And we first did what's called variable ratio tests, where you pressed a lever first once and then you got the food. Then you would have to press it twice to get the food. Then you'd have to press it 4 times to get the food. Ultimately, we did it in multiples, so then they would have to press it 16 times, and then 32 times, and then 64 times. So you get a sense of how long, right? I mean, somebody, and you could do this with humans too, will work, how much effort for the various substances. And in fact, if you look between sugar and fat, you see when we have different mixtures, you can see that sugar is the main driver. Here's just sugar alone, and when you add fat, you don't get any change on the variable ratio. But if you look at the fixed ratio testing, and I don't have time to get into it, but it's fair to say when you add fat on the fixed ratio test, you do see an increase. So sugar is the main driver, but adding fat is synergistic. So it adds to how much somebody will work for, want. So it's not just sugar, it's sugar and fat. Fact is, fat plus sugar, fat plus salt, fat plus sugar and salt. I used to think I ate to feel satisfied for nutrition. Each of those combinations stimulate food intake and drive those intake. We are wired, so that's the first point. Okay? Second point, we are wired to focus our attention on the most salient stimuli. It's part of being human. What do I mean by the most salient stimuli? If a bear came in here right now, I promise you, you will focus on that bear and not me. Right? I mean, if your child is sick today, you're thinking about your child. When you looked at that cover of the book, your eyes went toward which? The carrot cake or the carrots? For many of you, it was the carrot cake. There's somebody in this room, I mean, just anyone want to say where their eyes went toward the carrots rather than the carrot cake? It's okay. Right? There's always somebody, right? And we're wired, and for each of us, what is the most salient stimuli will vary. But you wouldn't be human. Your brains wouldn't work, you know, the way they work if it weren't for the fact that we are wired to focus on the most salient stimuli. Food is designed to achieve a remarkable salience or prominence in our minds. Here is just I was outed by the Washington Post. I was doing the research for the book. I went dumpster diving. So go into a restaurant and just, this is the grilled chicken. This is just the grilled chicken itself. It was labeled, the margarita grilled chicken, and you can see the ingredients in the chicken, what the chicken's bathed in, right? Not that what you see is it's bathed in orange juice, lemon bar mix, triple sec, soybean oil, tequila. I mean, I can go on, but what is that? What is it bathed in? And these are huge sort of cement mixers where the chicken gets tumbled in. Sometimes meat and poultry, there's needles where the fluids are injected. Right? It's almost as if the food is pre-digested. But what's in the orange juice in the bar mix? Sugar, fat, and salt. I mean, in the chicken you're eating. And what we did with our colleagues in Italy, Gaetano Di Chieri, we took sugar and we took sugar and fat, and we measured the level of dopamine. Dopamine is one of the brain chemicals. Dopamine is responsible for what in the brain? Is it pleasure? No, it's not pleasure. Dopamine is responsible, the current thinking is dopamine is responsible for grabbing your attention. It gates the attentional pathways. So it gates what is sort of allowed in to working memory. So it focuses you. And if you measure dopamine, and the general difference for years, it was thought that drugs, amphetamine, cocaine, elevated dopamine, and you did not habituate. So every time you gave an animal cocaine, you would see a spike in dopamine, and there was no habituation the second, third, fourth time. Food, if you gave the first time, you'd see a spike, but then second, third, fourth time, the difference was food, you would not see the continued elevation in dopamine. What we found was when you add sugar and fat beyond just sugar, you see the dopamine continues to stay elevated every time you give the substance. You do not habituate. So what has the food industry done? If you take chicken and you add sugar and fat, fat and salt, fat, sugar, and salt, pick any appetizer. Pick a favorite appetizer in a modern American restaurant. Buffalo wings. Right? So buffalo wings, what are they? The wing is the fatty part of the chicken to start with. Many times it's fried in the manufacturing plant. It's refried in the kitchen, in the restaurant. Right? So it's double fried. It is then, that red sauce is what? What's in it? Sugar and fat, right? And salt. And then that white creamy sauce that you add to it? Fat and salt. So what are you really eating? You're eating fat on fat, on fat, on sugar, on salt, on fat, and salt. Right? And you ask why we're getting bigger as a nation? The more potent, and multisensory food becomes, the greater the reward, the stronger the reinforcement learning. So the food industry knows exactly that when that cheese will melt in your mouth. It understands that roller coaster and those change in orosensory stimulations. Let me explain how it works, because this is really this cycle of consumption. I'm walking down Powell Street, and I start thinking about chocolate-covered pretzels. Why? 6 months earlier, I had been on Powell Street, and I had been into a place and had gotten chocolate-covered pretzels. I had forgotten about that entirely. But we're such effective learners that just location was the cue. Every time I land, just with plane lands at SFO, I start thinking about Chinese dumplings. Just on the taxiway, right? Why? Because the food court at the airport at SFO, there is a place with these Chinese dumplings. And so as soon as the plane lands, working in memory, right, that plane has become the cue for my thinking about those dumplings. If I can just make it to baggage claim, I'm safe, right? So there's always, next time you're eating, try to figure out what the cue was. Sometimes it could be the time of day. It can be the sight. It could be the smell. You know when the car becomes the cue? Just getting in the car, and the car sort of drives past. And the power of food, and this is important, it comes from what? Where does the power of food come from? Our brains. But where does the real power come from? Does it come from the taste? Sure, the taste is powerful, right, and stimulates. But the power of food comes from our ability to anticipate the food. So it's that anticipation of food, that cue, and that anticipation it grabs your attention, it activates your brain. There's attentional bias, there's arousal, it occupies working memory. And once you start thinking about it, and your brain gets locked in, what's your choice? How do you release that? You go eat it. And when does it get out of working memory? When you're done, or if you go on to something else, you get distracted. And, but every time you engage and you get cued again, and you eat, what happens? You strengthen the neural circuitry, and you strengthen that learning. Now, it's not just conditioning. You know, it's not just the Pavlov. We're becoming conditioned and driven, because it involves not only the learning circuits of the brain, but also the motivational circuits of the brains are involved. Because what happens if you try to stop this, right? If you have this cue, the sight, smell, location, memory, you have this urge, right? Your attention gets grabbed, your brain gets activated, you get aroused, right? You consume the stimulus, the reward. What happens in the middle of it, you know, when you get activated, right? And you say to yourself, you know, the inner dialogue, boy, that would taste great. No, I shouldn't do that. I really want that. Nah, I shouldn't do that. When you start thinking about it and you try to stop the cycle and break the cycle, you only amplify the power of the reward. So any ambivalence, right, I want it, I don't want it, that adds to, in essence, creates, you know, a discomfort, an anxiety, if you would. And that makes it harder to get out of this cycle. It only amplifies, right, the wanting. Remember when we were kids, we played with these finger cuffs, right? You put your fingers in and you pull, and the harder you pull, the harder it was. Well, in some ways, if you, you know, once your brain gets captured, once there's attentional bias, it focuses your working memory, and if you try to stop that, because it's driven behavior, because it involved the motivational, the dopamine circuits, as well as the pleasure circuits, the opioid circuits, it feeds upon itself, and it's very hard to get out of this cycle. Each of us are, you know, are vulnerable to cues and stimuli to some extent, and those cues and stimuli create urges and thoughts of wanting. But and hyperpalatable foods, fat, sugar, and salt, in essence, become hot stimuli, at least for many of us. But people vary in who's susceptible to this. So let's go. The cues activate the brain circuitry that guide behavior. This is a slide of an animal's brain and those circuits that get captured from the late Anne Kelly. And the behavior becomes rewarding and self-sustaining within this cycle. I wanted to understand how many people were like that woman at Oprah. And so we started focusing and asking, let me give you 3 characteristics that really are synonymous with a conditioned and driven kind of behavior. One is loss of control in the face of highly palatable foods, a hard time resisting. 2, a lack of satiation, not feeling full while one's eating. 3, a preoccupation, a thinking about foods between meals, or even thinking about food, right? While you're eating something, you start thinking about what you're going to eat next. So those 3 characteristics, loss of control, lack of satiation, a preoccupation with thinking about foods. Now, to some people, I say those 3 characteristics and they have no idea what I'm talking about. It's absolutely foreign. Right? Those are the individuals that I think in the end we really want to study, because I think they're the most interesting. Right? But what we did was we took a cohort from the Reno Diet Heart study that had been conducted, and we analyzed those individuals for those characteristics, and we found that 50% of obese individuals, 30% of overweight individuals, and 17% of healthy weight individuals report very high on those three characteristics. Now that may not seem like a lot of people, but if you extrapolate, and there's risks of extrapolation, that turns out to be some 70 million people. Now what's interesting is, you say, well, of course, people who are overweight or obese have more loss of control, lack of satiation, preoccupation. But what you see here is that there is a significant percentage of lean people who have those three characteristics. These are self-reported, who self-describe it's hard to control their eating, loss of control, lack of satiation, preoccupation, but they still are lean. So either they are at torment with themselves constantly, or, and some of you are laughing, right? Or they have developed certain rules and been able to condition themselves to be able to live with that kind of conditioned and driven behavior. So the hypothesis we had, right, was that highly palatable foods, which are what? Sugar, fat, and salt, is excessively activating the reward mechanisms of the brains of susceptible individuals, and that drives wanting for the highly palatable food, which leads to excessive eating. So with my colleague, and this is just the one slide I would ask you just to focus on this science. So I think this is the most interesting. This explains why that woman on Oprah is the way she is. And so with my colleague Dana Small and Alyssa Eppel, Dana at Yale, what we did is we took people who score very high on those characteristics, that conditioned hypereating, loss of control in the face of highly palatable foods, lack of satiation, a preoccupation with foods, and we asked if we could do brain imaging on them, and we imaged their brain during two phases. One, the anticipation phase. Didn't give them the food, we just gave them the cue, right? The smell of a highly palatable food, and then we actually allowed them to consume the highly palatable foods. And what you see is that the anticipatory response in the amygdala, right? Because the amygdala responds preferentially. That's part of the brain's reward circuits. That's the part of the brain that responds preferentially to the smell, for example, compared to the taste. So the cue, what activates your brain, the amygdala is part of the reward circuits that gets activated. But you find if you take people who are heavier, we take people who have this conditioned hypereating, and we analyzed for both, we see that the amygdala gets activated. There's an enhanced activation in people with higher body weights and with this conditioned hypereating. But what we found, and this is most interesting, is once they started to eat, right, actually consume the food, in people who didn't have these three characteristics, their amygdala shut off. But in people who had these three characteristics, there was sustained activation of the amygdala of the reward circuits. And it didn't shut off. It didn't until when? The food was all gone. So, I don't finish until all the food is gone. It really is you don't finish until your amygdala shuts off, until you stop being cued. So let's just review where we are. Food is powerful because it is rewarding. Jerome Kagan, the great developmental psychologist at Harvard, probably has given the best description of a reward, whether it's food or whether it's other stimuli that are reinforcing. The most effective rewards are the rewards that change how we feel. And certainly there's no doubt that food derives some of its power because when you consume it, it tastes good and it changes how you feel. But the power of food comes from our ability to anticipate it. Sights, smells, locations, time of day, anything that's associated with a reward gets planted in memory, and those are cues, and past learning associates those cues with the rewarding experience. And then the memories of past eating allows us to predict that reward. So those cues work by stimulating these urges, these thoughts of wanting. The cues grab attention, they stimulate arousal, they trigger the emotion, and repeat exposure to highly palatable foods, in essence, changes our brains. They condition us to focus our attention on the most salient cue, which trigger wanting and desire. Now, for some people, what's the most salient cue? It could be alcohol, it could be tobacco, it could be gambling, it could be sex. But for many people, it is, in fact, food. I was invited to talk to the food industry, and I said, let me explain what's going on. Let me see if I can draw an analogy. And again, we have to be careful in analogies with tobacco and food, but both affect the same reward circuits of the brain. Nicotine. Nicotine is a moderately reinforcing substance in animals and in humans. But when you add to that nicotine the smoke, the throat scratch, the cellophane crinkling of the pack, the color of the pack, the image that was created over the last 50 years, of the cowboy and the glamour and the sexiness, and the time of day, the belief that you're not going to feel normal unless you smoke, the sense that it was cool, that you needed it. What did we end up? We took a moderately reinforcing substance and we made it into a significantly addictive product. I give you a package of sugar and say, go have a good time, right? You're going to look at me and say, what are you talking about? Now I add to that sugar fat. I add temperature. I add texture. I add color. I put it on every corner. Right? I make it available 24/7. I make it socially acceptable. I add the emotional gloss of advertising. Look at an ad tonight. Right? Sometimes it's about the value, the economics of the food, but most of the time, what's the tagline? You'll love it. You'll want it. Right? You'll have a good time. Right? You add that emotional gloss. I make it, entertainment. You can do it with your friends. You can do it at the end of the day. You can release, all the stress of the day by going to have a good time. And what do you end up with? When you add all those sensory components, you end up with probably the greatest public health challenge that we face. So the important point, for certainly that woman on Oprah and for millions of people, certainly millions of Americans, and I think this is sort of the most important point to them, it's not their fault. It's not that they're broken or something's wrong. It's not a disease, and most importantly, it's not a matter of willpower. For many of us, our behavior has become conditioned and driven. Now, just because your brain gets activated, just because those reward circuits, you find yourself getting cued, that urge, that activation, that arousal, doesn't mean you can't do something to protect yourself about it. But think for a moment. What's the business plan of certainly of the American food industry, actually the global food industry? If you look at the business plans, it's been what? Sugar, fat, and salt on every corner, right? Wide distribution, available 24/7. There was a reason. Starbucks, no one was going in the afternoon. Why did they develop all these different kind of drinks? What's the goal? Sugar, fat, and salt 24/7, socially acceptable, something you want to do. What's the effect of that? What's the effect of that on our kids? Kids at the age of 2 traditionally compensated for their eating, which meant that if you gave a child more calories at lunch, they would eat less during the remainder of the day. You take that child by 3, 4, and 5, that child's eating fat, sugar, and salt sometimes all through the day. By the age of 5, that child's lost the ability to compensate. So it's the drive for reward, the reward circuits, in essence, override the body's homeostatic mechanisms. The real reason for writing the book, what I wanted to do was to explain to that woman what was driving her. and I wanted to be able to understand what was going on. I thought I would end up in the world of physiology, endocrinology, bariatrics, nutrition, because that's the world I'm comfortable in. What I found, what was interesting, was that where it led me was really into the world of what makes us human and the neurobiology of how our brains are organized and what drives our behavior. Not all our behavior is under conscious control. When the metaphor, I mean the question, I was always interested in why does that chocolate chip cookie have such power over me? Why does my hand reach out for that chocolate chip cookie once it's there? Why once I'm primed, P-R-I-M-E-D, once I get stimulated, why do I keep on going back for more? That was the question. And once you understand that overeating, if you can understand overeating, you can understand a lot about what makes us human. You can understand our impulses, our obsessions, our compulsions, because eating is just one of the very highly salient stimuli. Conditioned hypereating, this loss of control, this lack of satiation, this preoccupation with food, is due to the rewiring of our learning, motivational, and memory circuits in our brain. And salient food cues, that sugar, fat, and salt on every corner, trigger that desire, and evidence suggests that certainly in people who have conditioned hypereating, the reason it's not your fault is once that brain gets activated, it's not shutting off. And it is very hard to resist that kind of behavior. So now the question you all want to know the answer to is how do you cool down the stimulus? How do you change that once you have this cycle? But first, if you understand that the reason you're overeating is because you have this stimulation of your brain, that it's being activated, you're being cued, then you can at least figure out a rational strategy to how to protect yourself from that happening. We live in a world, a lot of the current views are, on the one hand, and it's almost like the Middle Ages when it comes to diet and eating. Diets are never going to work. Why? If you have that old circuitry and you have that old learning, and sure, I can for 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, deprive you or change your diet. But then I put you, and you'll lose weight, no question, but then I put you back in your environment, you still have that old circuitry. And I then continue to bombard you with the same cues, and you have that old circuitry, of course you're going to gain weight back. There's no question, because the only way, once that old circuitry is laid down, the only way to deal with it is to lay down new circuitry, new learning on top of it. So what are your options? Okay? How do you cool the stimulus? And again, this is true not just for food. It can be true for alcohol. It could be true for smoking. It could be true for drugs. It can be true for gambling. How can you protect yourself? So obviously, if you're being stimulated, you can prevent yourself from being cued. So you take out all the cues from your house, but how realistic is that if you're going to walk down the street? Not very easy. In fact, some of my colleagues in the obesity field think that the solutions lie beyond the individual. I don't agree, but they think that the individual is set up for failure because our environment is so toxic, cues on every corner, that there's constant stimulation. So limiting cues, certainly limiting the times you're being activated, would help. But there are other ways to do this, and that is, in essence, and this is somewhat anti-intellectual, but if your brain is responding and is being activated constantly, you're being bombarded, you need to develop certain rules. And in fact, if you develop rules and you want to follow those rules and you condition yourself to follow those rules, then it becomes easier. Right? What do I mean? If you know, for example, that something is impossible, that you're not going to do it, your brain is not going to get cued. When you get cued, your brain's not going to get activated. That's true for smokers. If you tell a smoker you can't smoke for the next 4 hours, it's impossible. Nothing you do is going to allow you to smoke. And you then cue them, you show them the pack of cigarettes, right? You then do the neuroimaging, their brain doesn't get activated. Watch on a plane. No smoker jumps. I haven't seen a smoker open the emergency exit and jump out because they needed a cigarette, right? But watch them toward the end of the flight. Once they know it becomes possible, right? So if you have rules, right, and you know you're only going to eat in meals, for example, then you start protecting yourselves from being bombarded. If you follow that rule. The French paradox. How did the French? They ate highly palatable foods. Why did they not gain weight until very recently? Because they ate in structure. They had certain barriers. They would only eat in meals. They would never sit in a meeting and eat foods. They would never walk down the street and eat foods. What have we done in this country? We've taken sugar, fat, and salt, stimulate intake, put it on every corner, and say you can eat any time, a day or night. And in fact, that was socially acceptable. So that social norm, both the French and to some extent the Canadians, that social norm, right, that social attitude can affect the individual's behavior. It can, what you find acceptable, can affect whether your brain gets activated or not. Because if you develop certain rules and you live by those certain rules and you condition yourself to live by those rules, again, it sounds somewhat anti-intellectual, but it will cool down the stimulus. But what's the best way, right? If you really want to change the power of a stimulus, right? Food has to be pleasurable. It has to be rewarded. If I deprive you of the food, you're only going to want it more. So how do you deal with something that you want? Because remember, once you're in this cycle, once you get cued, if your brain gets activated, if you try to resist, you're only going to want it more. So how do you deal with that? How do you deal with something that you want? How do you deal with something when that will activate your brain?
Do you make a plan for an acquisition?
So you plan helps a lot, but if you still want it, if you look at that huge plate of fries and say, I want it, that's my friend, that's going to taste great, boy, won't that be wonderful? There's nothing I can do between you, I can't get between you and that plate of fries. There's just no way. So what is, in the long run, right, whether it's an alcoholic or someone smoking cigarettes or someone eating food, right, what do you have to do? What was the most significant, what was the way we changed the success with regard to tobacco? Right. You got it right. On the first answer. The one thing that Philip Morris monitored more than anything else, the one poll number, was social acceptability. Right? Why? Because we used to view the product as something that was glamorous. You may not be able to relate, but certainly back in the 50s, our parents' generation, our grandparents' generation, it was cool, it was something that was acceptable, it was something that was sexy, the cowboy, adventuresome, and you added that emotional gloss, you made it into a positively valent stimuli. And when you take something that's reinforcing and it's positively viewed, what are you going to do? You're going to approach it. What did we do with tobacco? What's the real success? It's, I'm very much in favor of legislation and regulation, right? But we still don't have that yet on tobacco. The real change was we changed the social acceptability. We changed, what? So it was, you just for those who couldn't hear, the comment was, you look like a chump. Right? We changed the valence. It used to be positively valence. Now it's negatively valence. And when a stimulus is negatively valence, what do? You avoid it. Now, tobacco is easy. Food is harder, right? Because tobacco, I sat with Mike Perchuk back in 1990, and he said to me, and I didn't understand, really the value of what he was saying. He said, our job is to demonize the tobacco industry. I said, what? And here I was a federal official. I didn't think my job was to demonize an industry. Right? But what he understood, what I didn't understand, is if you change the perception of that industry, right? If you change something from positively valence to negatively valence, and you change how it's viewed, that social attitude, you'll change how people will respond to that, and whether, in essence, you'll also change the degree of wanting. And if I want it, that's my friend, that's going to make me feel better. That cycle of consumption, that brain activation is going to occur. If you can change that from that wanting to that's not my friend, that's my enemy. Listen to an alcoholic who got off alcohol. Listen to somebody who smokes who stopped smoking. Right? The real change is that's not my friend, that's my enemy. And they've learned that, and no one has told them from the outside. I mean, they've internalized that. Food is much harder, because can't demonize food. We need food. We have to enjoy food. So how do you change the wanting? How do you have this critical perceptual shift? How do you cool down the stimulus? How do you not want it? One of the reasons why I went inside the food industry is if you understand how food is being constructed these days, if you understand that much of what we're eating is simply fat on sugar on fat on salt, and that's just stimulating our intake, and you look at food and say, boy, I don't want that. That helps you change your own critical perceptual shift. So for some of us, we become vegetarians. Why is that useful? Because if you're a vegetarian, not that I'm advocating it, but I mean, it's very useful. Then you look at animal fat and say, I don't want that. Some, and I give a lot of credit to Michael Pollan and Alice Waters, let's eat real food. If you want real food, then you look at the rest of the food and say, I don't want that. I mean, for me, I went to a food coach. He said, what did you eat for dinner? I told her I thought I had eaten relatively healthy. I told her about the appetizer and the main course. She looked at me and said, you just ate the equivalent of 2 meals during that meal. You ate 12 ounces of protein. Here I'm a doc, I was commissioner of FDA, and I didn't even understand what 12 ounces of protein really were. But all of a sudden, that hit me that I could eat half of what I had been eating and sustain myself. All we really need is about 100 calories per hour, plus or minus. So for most of us, right, I mean, it's about half of what we're consuming on a daily intake. So I now look at this huge, you put a huge plate of food in front of me, and I go, that's disgusting. Right? That's only going to stimulate me to eat more. So for each of us, that critical perceptual shift is essential. Last point, and then we'll open it up for questions. Understand the implications. Right? Understand if obesity, right? And it's not just obesity, because there are people who are healthy weight who have a real problem controlling their intake. If there's conditioned hypereating, in essence, this obesity is being driven by the fact that we are conditioning and driving the behavior by constant exposure of fat, sugar, and salt on every corner, not just of us, but of our kids. That has profound policy implications. It has profound policy implications for the food industry, whose business plan has been to put fat, sugar, and salt on every corner and add that emotional loss and drive that conditioning and driven behavior. It has implications for government that has, I think, a responsibility for greater disclosure and greater education. But in the end, it really, just because your brain is being activated doesn't mean you can't take steps to fight back and try to prevent yourself from being manipulated by this fat, sugar, and salt on every corner. Let's open it up to some questions.
And here's the mic if you want it.
This, thanks for coming. And this talk obviously has been focused on food, and you suggested at the beginning that our eating habits are nationwide the biggest health problem we're facing. Is that true? Dollar costs, however you want to measure it, eating costs more than smoking or alcohol problems?
So my colleague Stan Glantz, there is a debate in the public health community where more people die from, where are the greatest deaths. And smoking still today remains the #1 preventable cause of death. Obesity certainly is right behind it. And I think as smoking, the good news is the smoking rates are coming down. Regrettably, the obesity curves, as you see, I mean, we don't know where they're headed. I mean, it's fair to say both smoking and obesity rank both up there and contribute mightily and very extensively to morbidity and mortality. But the incidence of diabetes, as you can see, I mean, it's just skyrocketing. And there was a question behind you.
My question was, you talked about fats being stimulators, but I'm wondering if you looked at all at healthy fats versus unhealthy fats, like naturally occurring fats and nuts and salmon, et cetera, and if those cause the same kind of reactions.
So fat is probably the most interesting compound. And again, what stimulates intake, young children, sugar alone is the main driver. And they, I mean, and you notice that the drinks they drink for kids tend to be more uni-sensory. One's driver. But as we get older, what drives our intake is the more multisensory food becomes. So it tends not to be, fat both satiates and stimulates. I mean, sugar stimulates. We don't have the data on, the different types of fats, but I mean, if you can avoid fat and sugar, fat and salt, fat alone probably, when you add it to sugar, will be synergistic, but it's usually when salt and fat are salt and sugar are added to the fat that drives the intake the most.
Speaking of French paradox, there was some speculation that maybe the problem is with growth hormones or other additives in American foods, high fructose corn syrup, and something that is present in American foods but not present in European foods. Is it true? No? Do you know of any science behind it?
The major driver of obesity still is the total amount of calories you take in. I mean, it's input, it's in versus out, and the question is what drives that calories. And I mean, I think the evidence we have is it's the macronutrients, right? Sugar, fat, and salt, much more than the micronutrients. I mean, there are real issues, I think, with, for example, antibiotics in feed that are being added, and probably we need tighter rules as a country. But as far as driving consumption, your brain is getting hooked on fat, sugar, and salt. That's what's hijacking the brain, not the micro nutrients or micro contaminants. The fat, sugar, and salt are what's driving, stimulating the intake.
Yeah, given this current economic crisis, a lot of states are now proposing taxes on junk foods and sodas to try to, of course, raise state revenue, but also they tout that this will be a public health benefit by reducing obesity. Do you believe that taxing highly palatable foods like that is going to have any effect as in terms of public health?
Yeah, I mean, it's an important question, and I don't know what the evidence or the empirical evidence would show. Certainly, taxing cigarettes was one tool to change, when certainly in discretionary, with discretionary impact and the elasticity of the demand curves did have an effect. But in the end, what's key is how you look at the stimulus. And government has a number of tools to, over time, to change, to help educate and affect those social attitudes. Probably the greatest, change in tobacco, I mean, maybe it was the tax, but certainly the secondhand smoke also changed it from a positively valence. People didn't want to be around tobacco. So there are a lot of things that go into how do you change how you perceive that stimulus. I think that right now, I think education, just explaining to people that this isn't their fault. It's not a matter of willpower. Their brains are being stimulated. Their brains are being hijacked. The advertising, I mean, just think about it. We always viewed advertising as neutral information, protected by the First Amendment. If advertising is a cue that's adding emotional gloss that's driving the conditioning-driven behavior, right, that has to have impacts on policy, right, and how we approach it. I'm not sure, the tax, how effective it'll be. I'm sure there'll be experiments, and we'll get the data. We're going to take one or two more questions.
I'm curious about the interaction between actually being hungry and the cues and stimuli that you talk about. So can the cues and stimuli actually incur a feeling of real hunger?
Sure.
Or, okay, so even if you feel hungry, you can't really trust that feeling. You may just be being tricked by the stimuli and cues around
So
you.
how you perceive, I mean, there's no question that, low glucose, other sensory changes are cues. And their body sensations, what is hunger? What's stimulating hunger? We still don't know that. There's clearly, protections on hypoglycemia. There are other signals, in all likelihood, from the liver, and we respond to that. Tell somebody who has a hard time controlling their eating, eat only when you're hungry, and you will hear from them, and they say, I'm hungry all the time. Right? And so there's no sense. While they're eating, right? They're thinking about what they're going to eat next, and there is no, except when they're very extreme, when they get very, very full. So in some ways, and I think this is still controversial, and I don't, where we are, what's satiation? What is satisfaction? Is satisfaction just the absence of stimulation? Right? Is hunger, even hunger, there are hunger cues and how one perceives them. Some people are very good at discerning when there are, this difference between stomach hunger and head hunger. I think for the vast majority of people who are overeating, they've long lost that ability.
This is the last question because we're almost out of tape.
So I've been told that the body fat you carry currently produces some chemical that makes you crave more fat. Is that true? If so, how does it work specifically?
It's the reward mechanism of your brain. It's the it's those circuitry. It's the we now understand the activation of that circuitry. The ventral tegmental area, the nucleus accumbens, the dopamine and opioid circuitry. Those are the key drivers of wanting and liking. Now, there are certain feedback signals, and we're learning more about those signals, but in the end, it's that circuitry where I showed you that brain gets activated and stays activated. All the inputs to that brain circuitry, we're still learning about, but it's not the periphery. It's your brain that is telling you and driving you to eat more and more, and that wanting, that urge, right, is because of the brain's reward pathways. And that, again, it's part of what makes it as human. It's part of what it makes us successful as a species. We like to think we're perfectly rational individuals, fully in control of all our feelings and our emotions. But the fact is, our brain has been built with many different compartments and many different systems. And those systems work together. Some have analogized it to a committee. Others have said it's a symphony. But not all that stimulation is occurring within conscious, nor do you have conscious control over that. It's the interaction of that conscious circuitry, that frontal lobe circuitry, as well as the midbrain that results in your behavior. A lot of things impact on that, peripheral and central, but in the end, it's your brain that is driving you, and that conditioning and driven behavior that is getting you to come back for more and more. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And he'll be signing books after this.